Decision analysis, again, it's about providing inspiration for applying decision analysis and explaining how it works. For the general introduction, look in this same channel for the introduction video. In the process of generating research with the aim of creating more knowledge, we generally do this. And this is the typical process for at least how we think about doing research for agricultural development. We often see the total body of knowledge before our research takes place. And then when our research is done, the results are added to this body of knowledge, thus increasing the total body of knowledge after the research process. This is the typical approach, but the question is, does it really help with specific decisions? Does it help with agricultural development decisions? The idea within decision research and many other approaches in development-related research is that we should try to do research for impact. So we have to know or have some conceptual understanding of the series of events that have to occur in order for our research to have impact. And here's how I think about this. So first we do our research. We do data collection, we do some analysis. We have outcomes from this research, often in the form of academic papers and reports, presentations and policy briefs. We have outputs from this, which is the ideal situation. There's behavior change, different decisions are made because of those outcomes from our research. And we have impact, ultimately lives and landscapes. Something improves in the real world. But this point here, where our academic papers or our policy briefs make people change their minds, actually change things on the ground, better decisions are made because of that, this can be seen as a fallacy, really. And here's a joke I like to say about this from theoryofchange.org. In order for the formula to function, really, there has to be a miracle in the middle. And so the professor's here saying, I think you should be more explicit in step 2, where this miracle occurs. And that's what decision analysis really helps, I think, is to be more explicit there in that step where we say a miracle occurs. What is actually the functional, operable, impactful output or result of our work that then does create this output and impact ultimately? So I helped myself to think about this by maybe adding some opacity to these things, to think, okay, it's a little bit less clear. Ultimately, I may know well what my research topic is and what my research might do and what sort of journal I'm targeting. I may know more or less what sorts of outcomes I would have, 1 paper, 2 papers, a policy brief, but I can't know that well from the beginning of my work. I can't know very well what the output, ultimately the impact will be on the communities that I'm working with. And I put a lot of question marks here. There's a lot of uncertainty. Actually, we know something, but we don't know everything about how this is going to work. But ultimately, that is our aim, is that somebody makes a better decision because of our research, because of our work. So the big question, the big fundamental question is, are we addressing decision-relevant questions? Are we aiming our research in such a way, designing our research in such a way that it does have this ultimate aim of generating real-world impacts? And have we communicated the uncertainties to ourselves and to our constituents, to our fellow researchers, and to the people who will be effectively, hopefully, impacted by the work? If we're going to do research for impact, then we should plan our work with a view to our impact targets. We should ask ourselves if we have an appropriate strategy. So another joke from the theory of change guys, did we set out to cross, as in their case, a very large body of water, but try to apply the method here at a bridge that was not the right method? Did we think of the right method to apply before we set out? And these guys might have chosen a boat or some other tool rather than a bridge. You may be able to think of cases like this in the research community. If we use impact pathways, that is, if we think beforehand what might occur, then we can think about these logical connections of the research and the impact, the outcomes and the impact in a plausible way that can help expose the weak links in our process that can be strengthened. Maybe if they had sat down and really planned out and drawn up a plan, an impact pathway for how their work of building the bridge would help them ultimately to reach their aim, which was to cross the water, they would have chosen a different approach. There's a whole body of research, a whole theoretical frame of research called transdisciplinary research. And in this work, really for agricultural development, we say you can't really do work for farmers. You can't really identify something that will affect farmers unless farmers are part of the research process. And implementation research is another similar theoretical frame, really. Whereas on the one hand, we do have a lot of open questions and countless unknowns and research needs, lots of things that could be researched. On the other hand, we also have already identified several options, things that do probably work and are having issues in their implementation. And really that's where more effort should be focused, how to get working tools effectively implemented on the ground, or to find out why these things are not being implemented. Decision analysis is a rather old, started really gaining ground in the 1950s. This is one of the lead authors, really a professor at Stanford, Ronald Howard, who wrote a book, Foundations of Decision Analysis. That's worth a read. It's a heavy book, but it's really interesting. And decisions, what are they? Really, that's the first thing we need to identify. In order to apply these approaches, we need to identify a decision, and a decision is an irrevocable allocation of resources. Once made, it cannot be reversed, and it's a logical choice between options. And it's an action we can take to get a desired outcome. It's important to keep this in mind when we think about how we're going to make our research have a real impact and a positive impact on something in the real world. Because without meeting these criteria, we're not doing the kind of research that decision analysis could be helpful for, at least in the strictest sense of application of these approaches. So I'm going to give you an example from Uganda. I worked on this project for some time. The Vision 2040, part of this vision for Uganda by the year 2040 includes pretty explicitly super intensification of agricultural production. They want to transform society from peasant to a modern and prosperous country within 30 years. This is President Museveni endorsing the plan, implemented by the National Planning Authority and a number of other institutions. One of the big aims here is, again, it's a decision, fits this decision structure because it is an allocation of resources. Once made, it cannot be changed. And it has a desired outcome, which is that they want to end hunger. So meeting this SDG 2, how to end hunger in Uganda. And the thinking is that through this super intensification of agricultural production, we'll be able to meet our SDG promises and other hunger-related promises that are made in these various action plans. Another example, I'm going to talk about these later in a future video, but another example of a decision that we've worked on is fruit trees and agricultural landscapes of Kenya. So Kenya also, this is nutrition related, would like to see better nutrition outcomes. They also have a Vision 2030. The Constitution, many resulting policies actually reflect this aim of better nutrition outcomes. And there are a number of institutions, government and non-government, which would like to plant more fruit trees, and specifically in approaching these rural farming families. But there's a lack of scientific support this is where we build our ground for decision analysis approaches, because there's not that much scientific support to anticipate the policy outcomes. There's an idea of how the changing the production, that is, increasing the fruit tree production on these rural farms, will ultimately influence and reduce the nutrient gap, that is, how much hunger and micronutrient deficiency communities are experiencing. But of course, there are some question marks here around this. There's uncertainty. And we developed this process whereby we think, okay, there's a development decision that needs to be done. You're seeing here the same process that I talked about earlier. So there's a development decision. There's an effect on healthy food with some uncertainty. People have more access to more healthy food. And ultimately, with more uncertainty, there's an effect on real impact on the ground, people with better nutrition. So emphasizing here, I think what's also important for application of decision analysis approaches is that we have uncertainty. And these decision makers, they have to consider all kinds of various aspects of systems in order to make useful decisions. They have to consider how these are going to impact systems, and these ideas that we talked about in the earlier session on transdisciplinary approaches, these can also be considered holistic in the scientific sense, and these holistic perspectives can help us connect with real issues. You may be familiar with Liebig's barrel, the idea here being that it doesn't matter if we apply it to the agricultural research, then the idea here is that it doesn't matter how much we know about some specific aspect if we haven't addressed the main barrier to development. If we consider the water in this barrel to be well-being, let's say, of a farming community, or health or nutrition or anything else, then we have to consider all of the aspects. And the main aspect that will hinder this development, if it's not addressed, then it won't function. In the example of Uganda's agricultural development, we have to think about really some of the main factors were whether or not these displaced farmers will have access to nutritious food, and other things like what is the total diversity of food available to communities, and can people access that food. So we have to think about the the lowest stave here in the barrel, if you will, and consider that also in our assessment, no matter how difficult it is to measure. Applying the tools of decision analysis requires an understanding of uncertainty and a good communication of uncertainty. It's really one of the main underlying goals of the approach. This is a map from which is appropriate actually at the time of this recording, because there are a number of hurricanes. It's hurricane season hitting the east coast of the United States. That's Florida in the background. These hurricanes are projected, or the projections of where these hurricanes might go are illustrated in this way by the New York Times, by other news sources, and people often misunderstand these. Recently, there was a big row about the president of the United States at the time, Donald Trump, who misunderstood this graphic to mean that as the storm approaches inland, as it moves inland, it becomes much larger and more powerful. So he assumed that this would then be a major devastating storm once it reached that part of the South, which of course isn't what's being projected here. What's being projected instead is that as we travel further out into the future from our current understanding, that we have broader and broader distributions of uncertainty. The larger circles mean greater forecast uncertainty, and the area of this can change as new information becomes available, and depending on what sort of information we have about past scenarios. So all these dotted lines in the background are what's called a spaghetti plot. That's one way of describing uncertainty, is to say, here's the distribution of what we think could potentially happen. But then to be a little bit more clear, to say something more concrete about what we expect in terms of uncertainty, we draw a distribution. We say, okay, with 90% confidence, for example, this is where we think the storm might end up in the future. But of course, as it travels along this path, this is sort of a side note. As it travels along this path, it does necessarily become, or does normally become weaker because of hitting land, the impediments of trees and buildings and land. So the National Hurricane Center prepares graphics like this one, maybe not so clean, but they do prepare graphics like this for news centers to allow the public to prepare for that uncertainty. But many people get it wrong, and this is also true, at least the interpretation goes wrong, and this is also true for when we describe uncertainty in our research. So we need to be careful about how we talk about this. This is an example of jobs forecasts. So if we look back in time at the jobs numbers, unemployment numbers, then we can see that we have some uncertainty about what unemployment used to be. So we can see here that in the past, these are vertical probability density plots. These are quite nice because on the y-axis you have just the percentage of unemployment, and on the x here you can represent different times, and then you can see change over time, and with the density plot you can also represent the uncertainty we have about our distribution. So it's not an exact number, it's not a line. Line's not appropriate, but rather these distributions of uncertainty. And at the end here we can, so of course when what's represented in blue about what happened in the past, we don't have perfect information. Yeah, we have some measurements, and from these measurements we can generate some probability, but it's rather narrow distribution. That is, we're rather certain about what unemployment used to be for the most part. And then we can project based on what we know from the past. At the time of making this graphic, we were still back in 2018, and we were trying to project into the future. And we said, okay, we have some uncertainty, quite a bit more than the uncertainty we have about the jobs now and in the past. We have uncertainty about the jobs in the future. And we represent this uncertainty with this broader distribution, but we do think that the jobs are going to go down, that unemployment rather is going to go down, and that jobs will increase. So as we move further into the future, much like the hurricane graphic that we looked at, we have necessarily greater uncertainty because we don't know all the things that might happen. There are lots of unknown unknowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns that may occur. And the way we use decision analysis, the way we use this distribution of uncertainty as an informative tool for decision making in decision analysis, is that we can look at these uncertainty distributions, this uncertainty that we have about a future state of something of interest, that is unemployment, and we can look at it under different cases. So we can say, okay, in case the government takes this action, let's say, for example, giving tax breaks to employers, or so that if they hire more employees, then this may, our projections may change. Yeah? Or if the government increases taxes or increases some other factor for cost to businesses, then unemployment may increase, so that this distribution changes. So we can compare outcomes, projected outcomes, under different conditions. That's the benefit of the decision analysis, or at least probability assessments, in trying to forecast decision outcomes. And you can learn more about this by looking at medium.com, and they have a lot of good information, a lot of ideas there to talk about uncertainty visualizations. Unfortunately, once again, another caveat for this, much like the hurricane forecasts, it can be off-putting for people to hear this oh, we have lots of uncertainty and here's the overlap. So it requires good communication about uncertainty and good communication about what should be done. Decision makers would like to hear some clear information. They'd like to hear some clear and confident projection and not a discussion of uncertainty. So how do we compare options when we have incomplete models? Well, there are lots of good examples out there. The most powerful of which at the moment is software development, the agile programming methodologies. And really what they say is that in order to communicate greater certainty about project outcomes, we need to be closer to the finish date, obviously. The closer we get to the implementation of the decision, or in their case, the implementation of the software, the better off we are at, or the better we are at estimating the outcome. So what really the big thing here, or the big positive feedback here for developing any kind of decision support or support for decision makers, is that we communicate honestly about our uncertainty early on. We don't make any promises, and once we get closer to, or once we have a greater understanding of how the system functions, then we can make better estimates. They have to use these incomplete models, and that's what we're doing, really, comparing options with incomplete models. We cannot have perfect information about the future under any decision scenario, because we can't go to the future. So we have to stand where we are now with lots of uncertainty and make some kind of a projection. And we make a projection which is based on our distribution, or based on our uncertainty. So the object of the whole thing is not to say what's going to be, what specifically will be the outcome, but rather whether what we're doing, whether the decision that's being made is formulated in the right way, and whether there are any critical uncertainties. And then at a certain point, we can make a more accurate estimate of the outcome. So that's from agile programming, agile software development, and you can learn more about that as a sort of format for how to build decision models and how to communicate decisions in an effective way. I highly recommend checking out some work from Hans Rosling. I'm not going to show his work here, but if you haven't yet come across Professor Hans Rosling's work, then I envy you, because it is absolutely fantastic. He posthumously, unfortunately, he died a few years back. Posthumously, though, he wrote this book, Factfulness, really groundbreaking work, and it says a lot about how we communicate about uncertainty and how we use data to inform our conceptualization of what kind of a world we live in, and how decisions might affect outcomes, and really how well we're doing as a global community at addressing issues, and how we can do better. Do check out his books. And if you have a few minutes now, then I would recommend just following this link, TED.com, and watch Hans Rosling give a very enthusiastic and brief overview of his ideas from the Gapminder project on thinking about development, and also lots of inspiration for communicating uncertainty and being frank about what it is that we don't know. So I'd like you to take some time now to think about an agricultural decision. Think about a real application where decision analysis approaches might make sense. So a situation within your research or related to your research where decision makers have to choose between different options related to agricultural development, and how decision analysis approaches might be useful, as far as you understand them so far, for approaching this. You can write to me, write to your team, and write to the rest of your classmates in our Slack group. And once you've done that, you can tune in for the next part of this series where we will talk more about decision analysis for agricultural development. Thanks.